Good afternoon. Welcome to session 1 of our 3-part micro-webinar series on email best practices. Today's presentation will focus on email deliverability factors related to compliance, email performance, digital reputation, and we'll cover even more things as well. Before we begin, I would just like to take a moment to point out some differences in the interface that you may notice on your webinar console. If you haven't seen On24 webcast before, this is our new webinar platform provider. So if you look at the screen, you will see that you can resize how your slides are positioned. You can move these little boxes on the screen around. If you want to adjust the volume, that media player on the left side will help you adjust the volume of the presentation. And then below, we have what are called widgets. So at any time during the presentation, you can go and click through these. On the right, we have a URL link to register for the next 2 webinars. We have a resource list with some documents for you. One is troubleshooting for On24, and one is a white paper about how to use inbound and outbound strategies together for your marketing. If you have any questions, that's your Q&A. And then you see our speaker bios. And again, as I mentioned, your media players, your audio, your slides, and your help button. So feel free to adjust that as you like and click around and explore. So before we get started, I would like to introduce myself and our co-host today. My name is Deneen. I'm the Marketing Manager for Technology Advisors. Many of you here today are customers of ours, but for those of you who don't know us, we are a business software consulting company. So we help businesses select and implement products like CRM and like Act-On, marketing automation, CPQ, business intelligence, and then specific to CRM, we offer training, support, and software customizations. So with us today, we have David Fowler, the head of Deliverability, Privacy, and Compliance at Act-On. David is lending us his specialized expertise for this micro webinar, and we are very grateful to have him. As a marketer, I know I'm constantly sending emails, so I definitely look forward to his insights and expertise. So with that, I will hand it off to David. Whenever you are ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Deneen, and good afternoon, everyone, from the City of Roses, Portland, Oregon. Here we are on a Thursday, and it's great to be here, and we certainly appreciate you taking some time spending with us today talking about all things deliverability. I've been in the space since 2003, so I guess I'm one of the old folks in this really interesting market segment. So please do send your questions in the chat box, and we'll have some time to address those as we get through to the end of the session today. But we're going to sort of talk about the agenda. We're going to talk about a little bit about the overview of the industry and deliverability, where we are as a market in 2017. A lot has changed in the last 5, 6, 7 years, and we're going to walk you through that. We'll talk a little bit about global compliance, because any good digital marketing program is not complete unless you're actually following the laws and your obligations under the compliance. We'll talk about email and digital reputation, which is very, very timely as it relates to you as the sender getting your message through to the inboxes. We'll talk about email performance, things that affect email, things that will affect your email program if you don't have these things wrapped up and put together appropriately. And then we'll talk about recipient influence on delivery, which is really, really important. It's about what your customers are doing and what your customers are not doing with the messages that you send them. More important today than ever before, recipient engagement is one of the major factors of any successful email deliverability program. We're going to wrap up and talk about the email conversion formula, and we'll open up for Q&A. So with that said, sit back, relax, and let's get going here. So let's talk about the industry overview and deliverability. And before we do that, it's important to realize, or at least understand, that your email address in the ecosystem is essentially your digital fingerprint in the online world, right? And you think about this in context about things like being able to get, you can't rent a car without an email address, you can't buy an airplane ticket, you can't log onto your social media account. So obviously, it really is the sort of the digital DNA that drives a lot of the conversations within the ecosystem. So let's talk about email state of the state. And this is really important because the reality is there's been a really fundamental shift in the mailing industry, probably in the last 3 to 4 years. You know, when you think about the things that the sort of digital landmines that you've got to navigate through today that just didn't exist, you know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, like social media accounts and mobile messaging and all these things, but they all play a massive part within the digital ecosystem. So in terms of the fundamental shift, you know, successful deliverability is based now on the recipient's actions, what your customers do with the message and what they don't do with the message. And I'm going to get into some of those highlight information a bit later on. But the recipient actions is a really big component of that. And you know, regardless of what sort of mail side of the mail market you sit on, whether you're a B2B mailer or a B2C mailer, the principles of retention-based marketing are in play regardless of the type of messaging you'll send. So the receivers don't care whether it's a B2B or a B2C newsletter or whatever. You are held accountable for the practices of those particular channels as the email channel has and will continue to evolve. I'm going to get into that a little bit more in a moment. So when you think about the evolution of email and you think about the evolution of the inbox, you know, if you send an email to Gmail today, there are numerous tabs within the email client that your email could actually end up in. And that's just a direct, you know, illustration of how the ISPs have evolved over the years and giving the recipients more manageability over their particular email real estate. So when you think about the value of email, I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on this slide, but the point being is that when, you know, obviously we just get completely inundated with trillions of messages from all sorts of digital data points now. When you think about the power of mail, it really is still, you know, the tour de force in terms of how many email accounts or how many email boxes are out there compared to, say, social media accounts. And these numbers are a couple of years old, but the point being is you can see the illustration as it relates to the depth and breadth of the email channel, and no one would disagree with that. You know, we all have multiple email addresses. We all get way too much email potentially that's coming in through those channels as well. So I just think this is going to go and get more and more robust as we move up the channel as well. So let's talk about deliverability. What is deliverability? You know, there's sort of three factors to consider when you think about deliverability. Deliverability is the industry term used to measure the success at which an email marketer, which is all of us here on the phone today, gets a campaign into the subscriber's inbox, right? So obviously, if you get your email campaign into my inbox, then you know essentially that message has been delivered. Now, there are certain things that layer on top of that to ensure a successful, you know, email program. We'll talk about that, you know, later on. But i.e., the number one goal is to get your message to the inbox, and then it's delivered. Deliverability rate, or is also known as the inbox placement rate, is the percentage of mail delivered to the inbox versus the spam folder. So if you send 100 emails out, 98 get to the inbox and 2 go to the spam folder, you have a 98% deliverability rate as opposed to 100% deliverability rate. And then the deliverability trifecta is a term that I came up with, and we'll get into this a little bit later on in the presentation. But really, it's a combination of email authentication along with your sending reputation, plus the user engagement. And if you get all those three components of the deliverability trifecta correct, then you will see a great program and you'll see great results as it relates to your efforts. So when you think about, you know, the email reputation landmines that exist out there, you know, everything in the digital ecosystem does and will get tracked by the receivers. So when you think about, you know, do I have a great onboarding strategy for my data acquisition practices? If the answer is no, then, you know, that's going to have an effect on your ability to get mail delivered. So you have to be wary of the things that will present you with a high-risk, bad reputation environment compared to a low-risk, good reputation environment. And on the slide here, those things are illustrated by, you know, your red, yellow, and blue dots, which you will get a copy of this presentation as you move forward. So definitely get to see that a bit more later on. Let's talk about compliance. You know, at the end of the day, all countries have a digital legislation that you have to comply with, regardless of you're sending to the US or to Europe. And the rule of thumb is that when you're sending email or doing any kind of digital interaction, you have to follow the law of the country or the destination country, essentially. You know, these laws evolve, they change, they manifest themselves as it relates to different levels of permission and different levels of consent. You know, some countries are more reserved than others. You know, we operate in the U.S. in an opt-out method, so you know, I can continue sending you email until you ask me to stop doing that. But the rest of the planet pretty much operates on an opt-in methodology, where you cannot start to have a digital relationship with an end user until you actually gain permission up front. And so, you know, this slide just illustrates what that may look like. The big issue, the big forthcoming or upcoming compliance change is going to be what's called the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which goes into effect in Europe next May. And if you are mailing to European citizens on your databases, then you will be required by law to follow and adopt the General Data Protection Regulation within your email program. It's a very comprehensive piece of legislation. It's the biggest rewrite of the digital law within the European Union in the last 20 years. So we can certainly spend more time talking about that at a later date, but definitely get that on the radar if you are marketing to European citizens. So I want to shift gears and talk about email and digital reputation, and because this plays a massive part in deliverability. And there's three key reputational terms from a digital perspective that you need to understand. One is email authentication, and what that is a technical methodology that allows you to establish your sending identity within the email ecosystem. It doesn't guarantee deliverability. In fact, nothing guarantees deliverability, but it does help to you to build a digital emailing reputation within the receiver community. You have email or digital reputation creates a sending benchmark. So, for example, if you have an email program that you've been running for several years, you have your own IP addresses, those IP addresses that already have established sending identity and sending reputation associated with them. If you're creating a brand new program from scratch, you have to build reputation up from a sending reputation as well. So a lot of factors go into the assessment and allocation of IP addresses and domain reputation, and you'll hear that term later on as well. But you know, the final thing on this is user engagement, and what the ISPs are doing is they grade you as a sender based on what your receivers are doing and how they interact with your mail. So three key digital reputation terms: authentication, reputation, and engagement. And we talked about that trifecta earlier. And if you get these three things correct and they are on cruise control, then you will see that reflected in your email program. So what's digital reputation from an email perspective? Well, it's your sending behavior that affects deliverability, right? And the issues that affect your email reputation include authentication adoption, email volume, complaint rates, bounce metrics, spam trap hits, blacklist inclusions, first and third party content, consumer engagement, domain reputation, and IP reputation. So you think about all those things, they have digital components or digital tracking associated with them. So a receiver can see exactly what is being sent, how it's being engaged, who's opening it, who's converting with it, and all these other things that come along with that. So it's a combination of all these little points that you know, combine to make a digital reputation. So to protect your reputation, you have to monitor your sending methodologies and your habits, and then to fix or to repair reputation when you do encounter issues, you get to fix the problem, right? And we'll talk about data integrity and confirmed opt-in methods in a few more slides from now. But the point being is that we all have sending reputations. It's very similar to a personal credit rating. If you have a negative issue that pops up on your credit rating, it's going to affect your longevity of being able to obtain credit. In the same concept, however, it doesn't work the same way, but conceptually speaking, it's the same thing. in the email channel. So what's user engagement? And really briefly on this particular slide, you know, what the net takeaway from this slide is basically there are two flavors of engagement signals, positive and negative. And when you're sending an email to an ISP, from this particular illustration, you could see that the ISPs and also corporate domains get to measure a lot more things about positive and negative engagement than the marketer can, because the marketer has a very limited amount of insight in terms of, you know, what is happening to a message when it gets to the inbox or gets to the particular domain that you're sending it to. And so positive signals include moving messages out of spam folders, marking things as not spam, replying to message, adding the sender to the address book, reading or viewing a message, for example, and finally moving a message to another folder. And I talked about the evolution of the inbox earlier. Well, you know, users can move things around in their email clients now than they never used to before. So these are all positive signals that the ISPs are looking at, and they have a direct effect on email. And then from a negative signal perspective, you know, deleting a message without opening it, and obviously up until, you know, things like ignoring messages and that kind of thing, reporting them as spam or getting a phishing attempt. So you have to understand the signals that are being looked at in order to ensure engagement. So in terms of reputation review, you have to measure your reputation. You have to create an exceptional recipient experience with the brand when you send an email out, obviously. And you have to make the hard decision to drop inactive users. Inactive users in an email program has a very dramatic negative effect on reputation. If someone hasn't engaged in your program for, you know, a period of time, it's time to let them go. Segment your lists as needed. You know, send to engaged versus unengaged users. And the thing to remember is that retention and acquisition email streams have different levels of challenges from a deliverability perspective than you would think. But email performance factors, this is a great slide. The net takeaway from this slide really is that you've got 5 areas of any email program that will affect deliverability. And the first one being the mailing system. If you're using a mailing system that is not finely tuned to the compliance levels it should be, then that's going to affect your ability to send mail. The next thing is your business policies, how you run your business, where you get your data from, how old your data is, and all these things that come into that will be a big factor of that. Thirdly, sender reputation. We've talked about that. If you send out email designing content that isn't necessarily HTML compliant, that's going to cause problems. And then finally, proactive data management. So those 5 things have to work together in conjunction in order to put your email program on cruise control. And if you're outsourcing your email to a third party or an ESP, for example, that ESP would have complete control of the mailing system. What they don't have control is over the other 4 components of a mail program. So in 2017, it's the sender of the message that has more responsibility to ensure correct deliverability than the vendor that you're using. Recipient influence on delivery. You know, recipients now have been given a choice, right? So delivery to the inbox has become a personal matter. So when you think about that, you know, my inbox at Yahoo is completely different than yours, right? And I interact in my inbox certain different ways. So certain specific behavior plays a large role in determining where mail can land. So if you're sending, say, for example, 100,000 emails to Yahoo, they're going to grade your program 100,000 different potential ways based on each individual recipient and not as a whole or a cumulative total of the email that you send. So that's something to really consider and keep that in mind in your program as you move forward. Sender reputation is important as we talked about. The recipient is driving the delivery conversion. They control the inbox. They control the user experience. Technology has evolved to grade and assess each inbox individually. And now more than ever, again, recipient behavior is paramount. And you know, if you're a B2B mailer, you have to start thinking like a B2C mailer because they're essentially the same email stream now. So let's talk about the email conversion formula. And I know we've got a lot of questions that popped in, so we can certainly get to those in a moment. But really, when you think about a good email or a more adequate or self-sustaining program, it's about sending the right message with the relevant content to the user to the right people, right, the right segment within your program at the right time, which is obviously a best practice, and you get those things correct, it equates to conversion success. So when you're using tools like Act On Software, you can set your program to do those things on your behalf. So it's sort of like the George Foreman play, you set it and forget it, and away you go. But getting that formula correct, is an art and a science, and there's no two products, there's no two programs out there that are the same. Everyone's program is different, and everyone's way that is managed are different as well. So keep that in mind when you think about the email conversion formula. So finally, in terms of some final thoughts here, obviously measure your reputation, right? So your own metrics is where you start. What you send, the data you get back. There's so many more testing methodologies out there that you can use today than has ever been before, and obviously reporting is more robust than ever. So basically, to measure your reputation, start thinking about those metrics that are coming back. Create the exceptional recipient experience with your brand. Treat your clients as you'd like to be treated yourself in the email system. This is really paramount. Personalized, direct information and communication is a great email experience, and obviously leads to conversion. And then really, I think one of the hardest things we do is we don't make the right decision to drop inactive users at the right time. And the reason why that's important is because if you're sending a bunch of mail to people who aren't interacting with it, it's going to have a very dramatic negative effect on your engagement. And obviously, we talked about engagement being super important in 2017. There's no reason why you shouldn't get those folks off your file. Segment your list as needed. When you think about onboarding programs and strategical direction, when you can bring someone into your email ecosystem, if you know that I like, certain traits or certain books or certain things that you've asked me during my onboarding program, then send me things I want to see. Segment me into a list that I want to get certain information that I've requested. And you can do that from a technical perspective now. Retention and acquisition email streams, remember, these have very separate issues and challenges associated with them, especially when it relates to deliverability. If you have an existing relationship with a user, then you can nurture that particular individual through a process and see them engage with your program. And that's different than sending an email out for someone that you don't have a relationship with. So that's a hard thing to do, is to get people to convert into a retention-based program for an acquisition methodology. And then finally, you have to remember that the road to the inbox is going to and has and will continue to evolve as messaging strategies change. We all open up email on mobile devices now. That certainly wasn't the case 10 years ago. So it's important to understand how your users are engaging in your program from a technical perspective, getting the insight as it relates to who's opening your email on what device will give you a relatively good insight in terms of how your customer base's inbox has evolved, especially as it relates to being able to deliver mail to those particular devices. So, if you get all these things done correctly and you get them on cruise control, then your email experience, obviously, from a deliverability perspective, is going to be extremely fruitful. So I encourage you to all think about that. So I know we've got about 5 minutes for questions, so I'm happy to answer that may have come in.
All right, thank you so much, David. We do have a couple here now, and as I mentioned before, if anyone has any questions, that Q&A little widget on the bottom is where you want to enter those in. So one that we have here is asking, we recently realized our system wasn't set up to opt people out after a certain number of soft bounces, so our sender reputation was affected. How long does it typically take to bounce back, no pun intended, from something like that? Is there anything we can do to accelerate the resolution?
Let me answer that question from the other side first, right? Meaning, soft bounces are sort of a bit of an anomaly. I mean, a soft bounce essentially is an email that isn't delivered or pops back to you because someone might be out of office or the mailbox might be full, etc. The first part of that question is I would certainly select or set that soft bounce level at probably no more than 3 to 5, as an industry best practice. Because as you know, if they keep coming back to you, then it will affect your deliverability. So to repair your reputation in that particular case, you could basically drip your soft bounces back in through a segment over a period of time, and that will allow you basically not necessarily to push your program to the limits, but it certainly will allow you to remail those soft bounces, assuming that you have your unsubscribe or your opt-out methodology back in place. So, soft bounces, a lot of consumers abuse the soft bounce from a frequency perspective because it's easy to mail to, but the reality is that if you exceed more than 3 to 5 in any program, it's going to be problematic for you. So you can remail to them, but just do it over a period of time.
Okay. Another question we have here is asking, you mentioned inactive users and removing those from your list. Do you have any best practices for how to define an active user? For example, how long should they be inactive before you decide to remove them?
So that's another great question, very timely actually. As I said earlier, there's no two programs that are different, right? And losing data is like losing your kryptonite, isn't it? In some respects, but we all have to do it. And the point being is that the shelf life of an email address now is probably less than a year. People move, they change their email address, they move up, they transition out of programs. If you've got people on your program that haven't been engaging in your program for 6, 8, 9 months, that's a pretty good red flag that you may have some dead weight on your list. So again, it's really dependent on how aggressive of a program you necessarily maintain or manage. But I would start getting some spider sensors going off if you're not seeing things within a 3-month period, right? And maybe try to take those inactive users, put them in a segment, and have a different strategy about re-engaging them into your program, because they will affect your other mailers, right? So it's definitely something you need to think about aggressively. But inactive users the reality is an inactive user is a direct result of a program, or could be a direct result of a program that has not potentially been onboarded appropriately. So when you bring me on into your program, if you allow me to set my expectations with you in terms of how I interact and how I manage my user experience, then I'm less likely to not engage. So it's kind of a catch-22, right? So I think a strong onboarding program and customer preference centers and all this good stuff really does lead to a more engaged user, which would then reduce your unengaged type data.
Excellent. I hope that was helpful. I found it very helpful. I will give our audience just 1 or 2 more minutes as we wrap up here to have any last-minute questions come in. In the meantime, I would just like to mention again that our next webinar in the series is going to be on August 24th, and we're going to be talking about data-driven marketing. And then the third in our series will be after that, and we'll be talking about how to use your website as a conversion funnel. As a conversion funnel. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to register for both with that link in the widget below, and you'll see David and my contact information on the screen here. If you have any further questions for either of us about marketing and email, Acton, obviously, if you're not using marketing automation, Acton is a great resource to help you do that and follow these compliance and deliverability best practices just by the way that it's innately set up. So it's a great program to initiate that. I also want to, before we run out of time completely, thank David again for lending us his expertise today, and thank you all for taking some time out of your days as well.
Thank you so much. Happy to help. Let us know if you've got any questions.
All right, and everyone, you can look forward to a follow-up email from me highlighting some of the features of this presentation. Have a lovely afternoon.